We're talking about the intersection of real estate investing and geography today. There will not be any manufacturing renaissance in the Northeast. Learn why. That's also the portion of the country where rent inflation has been slower. Learn the top 3 states for going out and getting direct foreign investment. Why the Jones Act hurt the Great Lakes region and why it will continue to do so. One shining United States city that's going to be a giant success story for the next 30 years and potentially a great place to invest in real estate. Also, a reiteration and a reason as to why California's population growth story is over. It's Geography and Real Estate Today with economic and geopolitical expert Peter Zeihan. Today's guest provides a deep understanding of geography, demography, energy, and trade, and he helps his clients make sense of a complicated world. And his expertise is relied upon by Fortune 500 companies and trade associations and policymakers and government entities at all levels, and also for GRE followers because he's been a guest with us several times over the years. He is a critically acclaimed author. His first 2 books, The Absent Superpower and The Accidental Superpower, are recommended by Mitt Romney, Ian Bremmer, and Fareed Zakaria. His latest project, Disunited Nations, became available in March of 2020, but he's got a new book coming out that he's going to tell us about. I think it's been a couple years now. Welcome back to GRE, Peter Zeihan.
It's a whole different world, isn't it?
It is 100%. In fact, the name of the book that you have coming out in May is The End of the World is Just the Beginning. Such a compelling title, and you bring this geopolitical angle to things like really no one else that I've ever met can, Peter. And that obviously trickles down to us as real estate investors. So before we talk about specific regions of the United States and their economic prosperities and futures and fortunes or downfalls, why don't we just take an overall United States economic outlook, since we had the exogenous shock of all exogenous shocks hit us about 2 years ago. Tell us about that.
Well, let me give you a bit of the backstory first. There were 2 big trends that we always knew were going to hit this decade. The first is deglobalization. The Cold War era is over. The post-Cold War era of open borders is over. And it's just a question of how quickly do countries start falling back into their own when it comes to manufacturing and supply chains. This was well advanced before anyone had even heard about coronavirus as a public health threat.
Hey.
And then the second one is demography. The global population has been aging at an ever-accelerating rate. Most countries crossed through the point of no return back in the 90s, and the few that have not did so in the last 10 years. And we're now nearing a point where many of the advanced countries are going to have more people who are retired than who are mature workers, than who are young workers, than who are children. It's an inverted demographic pyramid. And even in the developing world, they're actually aging faster now. So we've always known that these 2 trends were going to crest and crush the economic system as we understand it this decade. What coronavirus has done is it's sped everything up. By breaking supply chains, by giving countries a health reason and a populist reason to accelerate these shifts. We're seeing countries like the United States going through the fastest industrialization in their history as they try to cope with these issues. And so instead of it being an open question of whether the demographic and the deglobalization trends would hit us in the first or the second half of the decade, it's all hitting right now. And by the time we get to the end of next year, we're going to be dealing with simultaneous supply chain, labor, and financial crises interwoven, and it's going to be difficult to pick apart what it is that matters more to you. All of that, of course, impacts real estate, not all in a bad way, but certainly we are in for the next 24 months are going to be the greatest period of change that we have seen at least since the Second World War.
This is really substantial. Of course, things always change. Both geography and real estate are location-centric. Yes, this exogenous shock certainly brought up the rate of change and the rate of uncertainty. And really, as the United States and all nations progress technologically, we look at about 100 years ago, near the beginning of the last century, Willis Carrier invented the air conditioner, something a lot less ominous than what we're talking about here. But what that allowed people to do was to migrate into the United States South, a place that really wasn't that livable, that really wasn't that habitable. And one important demographic change that COVID brought is more people are on Zoom now, and more people are able to work remotely than ever before. So certainly that can create changes in migration patterns and so on. Do you have any thoughts with that there? Therefore, do we have somewhat more of a a decentralization where living in a United States MSA is less important? How much less important is it?
So many thoughts. Okay. I'd say that there's three big issues going on in real estate right now, writ large, kind of layered one step below those major trends. Number one, the baby boomers are retiring. They don't want to live somewhere where they have to shovel snow. Number two, the millennials, the oldest of whom are now entering their 40s, are discovering that you can't raise kids in a major urban area's inner city. It's certainly not in Midtown. And then third, because of COVID, no one wants to have to commute. So what we're seeing is a relocation of a lot of the professional class, especially millennials, especially boomers, away from the dense urban enclaves on the coasts, plus Chicago, and into places in the interior or in the south, the west, or the southwest. As they're getting away from the cold, they're getting away from high property prices, and they're getting away from metro-centric transport systems. And so if you're in a crescent from roughly Boise and Salt Lake City in the northwest down through Phoenix and Texas and all the way up into Hampton Roads, you're kind of in the magic zone for areas that are benefiting from these three interlinking trends. And if you overlay that with some of the broader stuff that's happening internationally, it neatly lines up, just coincidentally, because the Mountain West, the Southwest, and the South are also the areas that are benefiting the most from the Mexico impulse. They're benefiting the most from the deglobalization impulse. They're reindustrializing and moving up and down value-added supply chains most rapidly because they have more green space that can be processed for industrial use. And if you add this in with not just population growth, but affluent population growth, these are the parts of the country that are going to see the most rabid economic growth for at least the next couple of decades, probably more.
There's a lot to unpack there. You mentioned the millennials, younger millennials, and kind of that age cohort between 25 and 34. They're really in what I call prime household formation years, where they do want to get out of the house and not live with their parents. That's such a populous cohort. So some people look at overall American population growth as really not being that high, and the pandemic put that overall population growth rate in check. But we do have this demographic, really rich, a big population of people just looking to begin household formation. I know you probably have more to talk about there, Peter, but we had wanted to talk region by region about the United States and their economic fortunes as it relates to real estate markets and other things. And maybe it's best, Peter, to start perhaps where a lot of things started, where the Mayflower landed in New England. Talk to us just in general about the fortunes of those states, Maine down to Boston and the rest of New England.
I'm not going to say New England is screwed, because there's no part of the United States that is screwed. But if you want to talk about a part of the country that faces challenges moving forward, demographically speaking, it is already the most aged population we have. It is the most rapidly aging portion. And until roughly the year 2000, it was also the part of the country that could rely on a lot of mid and low and high skilled labor from the old world to the new. New York City, Boston, DC, these were the gateway communities for European migrants. Well, back in 2000, that more or less stopped. And so they're still getting in migration, but it's been a long time since New York was the most internationalized city in the country. San Francisco is more internationalized, Los Angeles is, and Houston has the #1 spot. New York doesn't think of it that way, but that's how it's been for some time. And so you've got a population that is honestly teetering on the edge of a major mass retirement, because you've got the greatest concentration of boomers in the country in the Northeast, and on average, the boomers will be retired next year. Now, they are not prepared for what this is going to do to their tax system, to their healthcare system, to their infrastructure. Because if you take people who are 63, they're at the height of their earning potential. They're at the height of their tax paying potential. But if you fast forward to 66, they're now no longer tax providers, they're tax takers.
Right.
And that is going to hit the Northeast writ large like a freight train. And it's not like boomers might go back. You never get younger, you only get older. And because there isn't a replacement generation coming up from below, and because the millennials who moved to the Northeast to have that urban experience are now moving out, you're seeing a serious hollowing out. And in that environment of insufficient infrastructure and ever tighter labor markets, you're never going to see a manufacturing renaissance in this area. Now, that doesn't mean this area is doomed. It's very high value. This is where MIT is and Harvard. These are places that are hugely value added and have associated industries with them. Biomedical, design, this is real stuff.
A lot of big brands.
Yes, but they're not going to benefit from the secular trends that are going to benefit most of the rest of the country. Doesn't make it a disaster zone, but it means it's not a growth story.
Let's drop to the next region further south, the Mid-Atlantic region. If you have more to say about New York, dropping south through Pennsylvania and through and into Virginia, that Mid-Atlantic region, another region that's often marked by places with high property prices and high property taxes, but not necessarily, because the western part of that region is, in essence, Appalachia. So can you just talk in a big picture about regionally those economic fortunes there in that big, broad Mid-Atlantic region? And I know that's difficult to do. We're still talking about a large region, but what are your thoughts with regard to the Mid-Atlantic, Peter?
I don't have too much to say about that. I mean, the broader Chesapeake Bay is obviously where America started. I mean, that's the original American story. A couple thoughts, though. Number one, no matter what happens with the baby boomer retirement, it means we're going to have a larger government footprint in the economy just because there are going to be more and more people, 75 million boomers, that are now going to be on the government dime. There is no way that that can happen without a significant build out of government activity in the greater DC area. So this is an area that needs to do a little retooling, but it's a retooling based upon ever higher government outlays. That is something that the city is well designed for. You move outside DC, and there are some concerns. This is an area that has not, in my opinion, proven very good at adapting policies to changes in the overall macroeconomic environment. They dealt very badly with globalization, and I don't anticipate they're going to do very well with deglobalization either. So you can have pockets that are success stories. The Navy's in the process of retooling everything it has, so the shipyards on the Chesapeake should do fine. But it's difficult for me to get too excited about anything else in the area because it's the same demographic picture as New England. But without the big names like Raytheon and Harvard and MIT.
And when we think about the two regions that we just talked about, New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, oftentimes we think about things like perhaps even legacy infrastructure. Does a new infrastructure bill of $1.2 trillion and all the money that's pumping in for roads and for transit, does that disproportionately help these regions or not enough or not so much?
It will disproportionately help this region, but honestly only because of the Amtrak state section. The Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic are really the only parts of the country that rely on Amtrak for anything. And so any money that goes into Amtrak was going to go into this zone. Makes sense. But everything else is spread among all 50 states, heavy on bridges, heavy on the interstates. That's going to go everywhere. So I broadly am in favor of infrastructure spending, but honestly, if all we're doing is catching up for the last 40 years of deferred maintenance, you're not talking about a big economic push here. $1 trillion of spending over a decade is not going to move the needle very much for a country with a GDP annually of 20 trillion.
Infrastructure bills are one of those rare things that can actually get some bipartisan support these days, and we sure don't have enough things that receive that. So thank goodness for that. Let's drop south one more region, not to the deep south, but more specifically to the southeast, Peter. Any particular commentary on there? So we're talking about the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida, those four states in particular?
Well, those four states have nothing in common. So let's start with Florida.
Florida should be its own region, yeah.
I mean, nobody builds anything in Florida. Nobody manufactures anything in Florida. So this deglobalization trend, Florida is just going to get passed by completely. That doesn't mean I think Florida is in a bad shape. It's still the retirement spot. And of the 75 million baby boomers, figure at least 25% of them are going to relocate. The single largest chunk of those are going to come to Florida. So if you know how to play those markets with that in mind, you're going to do great. Georgia and South Carolina, I like to consider as a unit with actually Alabama. These are the three states that are best in the country culturally for going out and getting foreign direct investment. And in a world where the global demography is tanking, but the American one is broadly stable, There are a lot of foreign companies who realize the only way they can remain in operation is to move assembly and manufacturing facilities into the United States. So the question is where? And if Alabamans and South Carolinians and Georgians go out and lay out the red carpet and actually go to Paris or Rome or Seoul or Tokyo and explain why it's the perfect spot and are willing to change things about their systems in a way that people in Pennsylvania would never even consider, well, then it comes here. So whether it's Charleston, Atlanta, Mobile, Montgomery, or Birmingham, I see just a huge amount of industrial expansion in all of these spaces. And it's not the low end, it's the mid and the high end. This is the stuff, these are the type of jobs that most Americans say that they would love to come back. It will be very different community by community, because again, you have to get the people in the South who go out to get the investment. And if a city doesn't do that, they won't get any.
When you and I spoke a few years ago, we learned that Alabama is the #1 state for per capita foreign direct investment, something that sure might surprise a lot of people. Of course, these areas don't just cater to people that might want to move to a place that has a low cost of living, but businesses also might want to relocate there because there's a low cost of doing business or a better tax climate and so on.
And Charleston is the #1 metro for FDI.
Charleston, South Carolina, the #1 metro for foreign direct investment. That's an interesting piece. Why don't we move north to a place that hasn't had as much uptrending economic currency as some of the others, and that's the Great Lakes region, Peter. So we're talking about really, including Wisconsin down to Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, some of these places that can have good cash flows for real estate investors, but oftentimes their population isn't growing too fast. So what are your thoughts just broadly about the economic fortunes of the Great Lakes region, Peter?
Now, this is another one of those regions that within each subregion, you're going to have a very different story. So Greater Milwaukee, for example, that's kind of where the middle manufacturing of America happens. The high precision work, small and medium-sized companies that plug into every supply chain we have in the country. Very high skilled, very stable, having some problems with labor as the baby boomers retire, but everything else about their business model works. They're close to Canada, they feed into the Mexico system. It's good. But it's right next to Chicago. And don't get me wrong, I love to go to Chicago and gain 5 pounds every time. But Chicagoland is going to have a real big problem with the baby boomers leaving and the millennials trying to find a place that can raise a family. It's also one of those metro cities. So it's really the only major metro that's not on the coast that might actually suffer from some of these big demographic trends. And if you've got Milwaukee right there, there's no need to build much manufacturing in Chicago proper. So I can see the balance between those two cities shifting significantly over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. The biggest problem that the greater Great Lakes region has overall is transport. One of the reasons why globalization was such a success is the United States had kind of hobbled itself. The fastest way, the cheapest way to move things from A to B is by floating them. It's about 1/10 the cost of moving them by truck.
Yeah.
And the United States waterway network, which includes the Great Lakes, has more miles of interconnected, naturally navigable waterway within a country than any other part of the world. In fact, more than everyone else in the world combined.
So it's an irony that any of these places would have transportation problems.
Right. But we did it to ourselves. Back during the Great Depression, we passed something called the Jones Act or the Interstate Commerce Acts. And we said that any cargo transported on water between any two cities had to be on a vessel that was American built, owned, captained, and crewed. It was designed to stimulate the shipping industry. And instead, it did the opposite. It just pushed everyone to road, rail, and ultimately plane, because we don't have those restrictions on our other methods of transport. So this region had the best setup on the planet. That's why it was the Steel Belt. And then we took that away, and that made it the Rust Belt. So if you could theoretically amend the Jones Act, so all of a sudden the greater Midwest in general and the Great Lakes region in specific could start benefiting from some of its natural geography, it would turn this region around significantly. But I don't see that happening under the Biden administration. And the Trump administration was so aggressive at courting the unions that it didn't happen under the Trump administration either. So this is something that's one of those, it should be a no-brainer, but because of American politics, it's become a bit of a pie in the sky.
Do you see any particular bright spots or troubling spots in the state of Ohio, whether that's Cleveland or Columbus or Cincinnati or elsewhere, especially with their legacy of manufacturing and the fact that there is some deglobalization occurring, Peter? Does that affect the economic fortunes for Ohio?
The challenge for places like Ohio or Western Pennsylvania, or really Eastern Pennsylvania, any place that is we think of now as the Rust Belt but still has a lot of legacy manufacturing, is what happens when stuff comes back. It's not going to look the same. It's going to be more capital intensive. It's going to be less labor intensive. It's going to be more value added. There'll be fewer line jobs. There'll be more custom work. And the labor force and the infrastructure are going to have to be adapted to that new reality. One of the big advantages that the South and that Texas have is because they don't have that legacy brownfield that needs rehabilitation. They can just start with something new in a new industrial park where land is cheap. Anytime you're talking about the Great Lakes, anytime you're talking about the Northeast, you have that sunk cost that is no longer appropriate for the manufacturing models of the day. And so if you can get an aggressive, outward-looking city council or state development board who can help municipalities with this, they can do well because they already know how to do this stuff. But they first have to basically unlearn 70 years of patterns that just no longer apply.
We're talking with Peter Zeihan. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. We're talking about geography specifically in the United States, and much like Lewis and Clark, much like Manifest Destiny, we are moving west. As soon as we come back from the break, you're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Peter Zeihan. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold.
Americans are not saving for retirement. It's going to get worse as people live longer, so you need to think differently, but you can't lose your time. Real estate is the investment vehicle that has created more million and billionaires than anything else. Get Rich Education is one of America's top investing shows disrupting Wall Street. Your host, Keith Weinhold, is a true financial educator and has been an income property investor since 2002. Get Rich Education has created millions in passive monthly income for its followers. Now, Keith has a free course. Real Estate Pays 5 Ways. Sign up now at getricheducation.com/course. Invest in what produces income for you now and later. Use the link in the description to take the course for free. Real Estate Pays 5 Ways. Get Rich Education is on every podcasting platform and has its own native iOS and Android apps. Join Get Rich Education Nation to create financial freedom through real estate investing. Subscribe wherever you listen.
You're listening to the show that's created more financial freedom for busy people just like you than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. We're talking with Peter Zeihan, Zeihan on geopolitics. You can learn more about him. His last name is spelled Zeihan. So let's talk about Texas, a place that's seen strong year over year in migration and a lot of businesses relocating to Texas, oftentimes from California or elsewhere. Talk to us about the surging economic engine of Texas, Peter.
Let's start by talking about what Texas is not. Texas is not where foreigners go. It does not have a reputation for attracting foreign direct investment at all. The idea that a bunch of Texans are going to get together and go to London or Beijing in order to put together an investment deal, it just doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is the Texas governor gets together with a few municipality mayors and tours states in the United States that are facing tax problems. And they say, oh yeah, you can stay in Illinois and pay 20% tax, or you can come to Texas where we'll give you a 20-year deferment and you pay no tax. It's kind of a jerk move, but it works really well. And that kind of sums up Texas. Everything is inexpensive. It's where the food comes from. It's where the energy comes from. The land is cheap. Mexico is right next door. It's got the major port in Houston. It's a financial center. It's an energy center. It's a manufacturing center. It's a processing center. It does all of these things. And during the globalized era, Texas would take a raw commodity like oil and ship it out, or maybe process it into refined product and ship it out. And that would be the end of the story. But what is happening now? As international trade becomes more difficult, as security becomes an issue again, a lot of these low value to bulk commodity plays are building up in Texas. And so the Texans are doing the next logical thing. They're taking a step up. So they're not just producing natural gas. They're taking the natural gas and turning it into ethylene and then turning it into the intermediate products that we use to make everything from plastics to safety glass. And now they're making the plastics and the safety glass. And so Texas is one of those places that any manufacturing that used to be there was almost incidental. But now there's a dedicated effort, particularly on the Gulf Coast, for moving up the value-added chain. And with every step they move up, it provides opportunities for everyone else in every manufacturing supply chain to relocate to take advantage of these intermediate products that are now available in huge volumes. So that's kind of piece one of the Texas current story. Piece two is, of course, Mexico. Say what you will about the Donald Trump administration. The renegotiation of NAFTA was a brilliant call. It was probably overdue by 15 years. And because of that, we now have a higher percentage of local content, that's content produced in North America, with the vast majority of it coming out of Texas and Mexico. Texas nearly trades as much with Mexico as the rest of the country combined. This has obviously been huge for automotive, but it's also moving into electronics and aerospace in a very big way. And anything that weakens supply chains internationally strengthens them within North America. And Texas, against all odds, is now coming up against a new problem: labor shortages. And so Texas is just hoovering up people from across the entire country. And honestly, from the Texan point of view, people can't move to Texas fast enough. So that's kind of the second big piece. And then the third is the internal migration story. Remember, I said that people were moving to the west, the southwest, and the south. Texas is right in the middle of that. It has the cheapest land and the cheapest power and the cheapest food of that entire broader region. And of all of the Texas cities, most of which I'm very bullish on, the one that is probably going to have the biggest success story for the next 30 years is by far Houston, because it has its finger in each and every one of those pots. It works with the Mexicans. It's in the energy sector. It's its own financial link. It's on the highway system that links into the East Coast. It's very good at moving large pieces of metal around, which means it's getting into heavy equipment. It's already in automotive. It has everything. And what we're seeing now is it's no longer just an energy town. It's probably already the third largest metro in the country. It probably passed Chicago last year. And unlike Austin, where the population growth is mostly from in-migration, it's kind of a tie in Houston between in-migration and organic population growth. So this is a city that quite literally has its best decades ahead of it, and it's already pretty good.
When a lot of people think about where Texas's population is, we spend a lot of time here talking about it. It is that Texas triangle, that geographic triangle in the eastern portion of Texas that begins in Dallas. You draw a line down to San Antonio and over to Houston. Peter clearly really liking Houston's economic fortunes, as like much of the rest of the Texas, it continues over the decades to diversify out of just being all about oil there. And what a prosperous place Texas has been. It sounds like it's poised to continue to be. Peter, why don't we move north again, a really wide swath, almost a ridiculously wide swath to talk about its economic fortunes, but from Oklahoma all the way up to Minnesota and kind of what we think of as the Great Plains region, including the Dakotas and Nebraska and Missouri, even over to St. Louis. You have any particular thoughts there?
Let's split this into two chunks, east and west. So the east side, the I-35 corridor, that's the NAFTA superhighway. The Texans have been very aggressive at expanding their manufacturing footprint and their draw for their supply chains to include Tulsa and Oklahoma City, because they need more population, and that's the only direction to go. You move north of Oklahoma, though, you're in a different world. The Twin Cities are the most isolated major metro that we have, and Iowa is largely rural or a small town. There's only so much you can do with that. It's demographically stable. It's one of the demographically youngest parts of the country outside of Utah. But it's really not well hooked up into anybody else's systems. And I have a hard time seeing the Iowans and the Minnesotans changing their local culture to attract outside investment. And I say this as an Iowan. We have a very field of dreams approach to development. If you build it, they will come, and we shouldn't talk about it. Because that would be, rude. So I see no reason to expect those two states to not be stable, but I also don't expect them to experience any sort of outsized growth. The Great Plains, it's just a question of whether or not the local political leadership decides to go out and get something. Obviously, infrastructure is difficult because of the distances, but as you move closer to the Front Range, you start to get integration with the mountains, and you start to get access to the Denver and the Albuquerque population centers. And so you have the widest variety imaginable in economic development and real estate in the Great Plains of any other part of the country. And so anything that I tell you that is true for one population center is going to be radically wrong for the other one. But they all have kind of two general thoughts. Number one, you link in with a major metro. The Front Range, kind of like the Texans, has a labor shortage, and they will draw from wherever they can get it. Second, we're now getting Zoom communities throughout this entire area. People who not necessarily are relocating from New York City to South Dakota, but people who are in South Dakota who don't want to move to New York can all of a sudden still work for a New York company.
Right.
And we're getting these little clusters that we used to only see up and down the eastern seaboard popping up all over the Mountain West and all over the Great Plains, where you can have small little clusters of workers who just telecommute. It's a very different economic model. It's difficult to know just how rich of a process this is going to be, but something to consider. Baby boomers are retiring. They're the ones who love offices. Gen X is taking their place. Gen X hates going into the office. So all of a sudden, the people who are in charge of deciding work schedules and what to invest in commercial real estate have, as a generation, turned against the entire asset class. That means if you want to work from Nebraska, go for it.
Yeah, office real estate has certainly been troubled. It's funny, as we've talked about most of the regions now, Peter, how labor shortage is a phrase that keeps coming up. Decades ago, people wouldn't have believed that. Even a century ago, most people would have thought that, oh, well, technology is going to make all the jobs go away. No, we have more jobs than people by a factor of about 10 million in the United States now. And Peter, you mentioned at one time as both an Iowan and Texan. Have you been both of those things?
Oh, I'm originally from Iowa, so I lived there till I was 18, and then I moved to Texas when I was 26, and I lived there for 19 years. I'm now in Colorado.
All right, well, let's move further west. We talked about the Intermountain West a fair bit. Now, let's talk about California, a place that often makes big, flashy, splashy headlines. Of course, we mentioned previously a lot of that migration from California to Texas, and a lot of people mistakenly think California is losing a lot of population, when actually it's been pretty stable due to foreign migrants and so on. So just talk to us more about the economic fortunes or misfortunes of California, Peter.
Everything you hear about California when it comes to regulation and cost is true. There's limited land that you can do things with on the coasts. Sure, there's lots of land that's flat in the Central Valley, but it's all agriculture, and it's not exactly a migration magnet for people who are in high value-added industries. So all the land that is available in California pretty much has already been grabbed. You will have communities on the edge of, say, the Los Angeles basin that are going to try new things as the population matures and ages and becomes more skilled, because in that sort of environment of rising labor costs, it makes sense to move someplace where you might be able to mitigate the land cost. So on the fringes of greater LA, I can see a lot of growth activity happening, and I think we're seeing that. But the population story for California is over. For the last 20 years, the population growth, the population stability that we've seen in California has been because of a very finely tuned balance. The Californians who have been there for a generation or more are moving out, and a new generation is moving in. And so in-migration has kept the numbers from falling.
Yeah.
But the same urbanization and depopulation push that hit the Europeans 60 years ago hit the Mexicans 25 years ago. And Mexico's population is now stalling. And Mexico's ability to send people north of the border is ending. And if you add in the baby boomer retirement, California is probably looking at decades of depopulation moving forward. Now, not catastrophic and not rapid, but everything that is true about California from a cost point of view now has to layer in higher labor costs at the low and the high end simultaneously. And that is going to put pressure, more pressure, building pressure on them each and every year moving forward.
Now, recently, Governor Gavin Newsom opened things up so that there aren't so many places that are zoned specifically for and exclusively for single family residences, therefore allowing for there to be more density, and that can have its own consequent NIMBYism problems and so on. But do you have any thoughts with regard to that sort of stance, with therefore allowing more people to live in a certain region and helping that soak up some of that land use saturation?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great things about California is despite everything that the state government consistently gets wrong, people still want to live there. And so if you can take actions at the margins to remove some of those barriers, you will have an outsized impact. It's a lot of low-hanging fruit that California can address should it choose to. Now, I don't want to predict that they're going to choose to do it, because this is a state that has spent 90 years trying to get a meaningful rail connection between the northern and the southern half of the states and still hasn't been able to pull it off. I mean, this is like 1870s levels of urban planning that California just can't wrap its mind around. But each individual tiny little, and from the point of view of everyone else in the country, incremental, almost infinitesimal improvement, you can do a lot. They just need to do it.
California, part of it has a Mediterranean climate. Some of the most beautiful national parks I've ever visited in my entire life, bar any nation, are within the state of California. Well, Peter, let's move to the last region, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii. Anything particularly notable there, either in the economic fortunes or misfortunes category for those 4 states?
I see Oregon and Washington, at least the western part where the major population centers are, as the next California. And I don't mean that in a good way. The amount of land that they have to work with is even lower, and they are a much more rapidly aging population, which makes it even more difficult for anything to happen. So just when you're dealing with issues like civic code, not coding, it's, in my opinion, even more intractable when you're talking greater Portland or greater Seattle. Now, if you move to the other side of the mountains, into the interior, and you kind of have an echo of what's going on in the Great Plains.
Talk about places like Yakima and Bend.
Yeah, and Tri-Cities. These are very rapidly growing places. They've got high quality of life. They benefit from the infrastructure of urban-dominated states who still splash the money on the rural regions. They're physically beautiful. The weather is reliably good. So just like in California, you can have this split between an urban core that is wrestling and losing when it comes to the major changes going on, and some smaller population centers that most people don't really think about. So like Tri-Cities might be the Sacramento of Washington, if you will, that actually have a ridiculously complex cultural scene locally and are very rapidly growing urban areas.
Well, Peter, this has been so interesting, spanning across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, talking about fortunes and economic misfortunes, especially as it relates to you as a real estate investor. Is there any last thing that you want to tell us, perhaps even if it's an international one that could affect the United States? You talked to us about Mexico a little bit. You have this big, wide, global geopolitical lens. Any other potential exogenous shocks or just something less dramatic that could affect the United States real estate market from a foreign perspective or a domestic one?
Sure. One is demographic, one is financial. On the demographic side, the same thing that's happening in the United States with the retirement of the baby boomers is happening in the wider world. But what is unique about the American baby boomers is they actually had kids. So we've got the millennials, which are a large generation, which are providing a lot of consumption and ballast. That doesn't exist in most of the rest of the world. No one else's boomers really had children. So when they move into retirement, they take their paychecks and their labor with them. A lot of these places are going to hollow out. And if you're a boomer in that environment and you have the money, you're going to try to leave because the services won't be there, the tax base won't be there, the government activity isn't going to be there, and you're looking at general economic degradation on a broad scale that we have not seen as a species in well over a century and a half. That's kind of piece one. Piece two, if you're a government in this environment and your tax base is hollowing out and global trade's going away, your only real option left is to print currency to pay the bills. So we're having massive capital flight, not just from the boomers looking for a safer spot, but for anyone who can get grab a chunk of those flows and get it to some place that's a little bit more stable. And in 9 cases out of 10, that more stable location is the United States. So we have seen over the last 10 years an accelerating flow of funds and people at the top end from the wider world to the United States. I expect that to double and triple in the next few years.
Peter Zeihan is one of the preeminent geopolitical experts. Peter, before you go, tell us about your new book. It comes out in just a few months here.
End of the World is just the beginning. The whole idea is to show what the world is going to look like in deglobalization. So all of these structures and all this trade that we've become used to in manufacturing and finance and agriculture, it's all going away in the next few years. So the book's process, the book's topic is to figure out what is next. What does our world look like when it's no longer connected?
You mentioned here earlier about the ominous uncertainties in the next 24 months.
Well, the original plan was for the world to fall apart in a more or less sedate schedule over the course of a decade, but COVID has just thrown that plan into the blender. We're now looking at manufacturing supply chains, relations with the Chinese, the European common currency, everything basically breaking down in a much more accelerated process. There are very few parts of the world that can function without an overarching American security presence. And between the Trump and the Biden administrations, that is now completely gone. And COVID has removed any sympathy that Americans might have had towards the wider world. And so we're honestly just kind of marking time for the first big international crisis where the Americans just stand back. And as soon as that happens, a lot of this connecting material that allows our world to function just snaps. And then we see where the chips fall.
It's been an increasingly polarized world and an uncertain world, and you really help people make sense of it all. Peter, it's been so great having you back on the show.
Pleasure. Until next time.